Clemson, a nationally ranked university, was founded on the principles of Thomas Green Clemson's vision of creating a seminary of higher learning. According to the university's mission statement, Clemson's vision is focused on the future while we remember where our roots were first planted. However, Clemson has some deeper roots that have been buried for some time. All of the routes lead to Fort Hill, as it is the historical center of Clemson University. In fact, the university was built around it. A National Historic Landmark, Fort Hill was the home of John C. Calhoun, who was a powerful figure in the 19th century. He served as vice president under the administrations of both John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson, as Secretary of State under John Tyler, as Secretary of War under James Monroe, and as both Congressman and Senator of South Carolina. What is not so well understood by the current Clemson student body is that this home was not simply Calhoun's country retreat. It served as a cotton plantation with some 70 slaves tending the property. Many students are also unaware of the fact that Calhoun's son-in-law, Thomas Clemson, who was willed Fort Hill after his wife's death, was also a slaveholder of some 40 slaves at his plantation, Canebrake, or that the house was considered a memorial to the Southern cause. Scribner's Monthly magazine in 1881 said Fort Hill had become a point of pilgrimage for those whose imaginations still cling to the old order of things. The Daughters of the Confederacy, who financed a 1930s restoration of the old house, hoped that it would perpetuate the culture of the Old South. A local newspaper said, "The home stands for all that was high and true in the Old South, a symbol of wisdom and learning. And the Old South lives on at Fort Hill." At the same time as Clemson became more diverse in the 60s and 70s as a result of federal integration, the university began rethinking Fort Hill and what it memorialized. The property became a centerpiece for historic preservation and tourism management. The university still sees the property as a memorial, but a memorial to the philanthropy of Calhoun and Clemson, and this poses a problem. If we only focus on Calhoun and Clemson's legacy of philanthropy, we silence other voices.
You know, so there's this complexity about Thomas Green Clemson that I think people want to distance themselves away from and only focus on the Renaissance man. You know, Clemson is a wonderful place, but on the other hand, our founder was a slaveholder as well as a diplomat. He purchased enslaved black people as well as served, you know, the United States government as kind of the first Secretary of Agriculture.
One of the things we've tried to do with the Department of Historic Properties is to make the house more of an academic center for the campus.
One way Clemson students, faculty, and the community remain blissfully ignorant is through the perpetuation of a superstition. If you walk through Fort Hill, then you will not graduate.
And as I took the tour, one of the things that I noticed that was sort of notoriously absent from the conversation was the word slavery or enslaved people or slaves. And we know that slaves lived and worked here and likely died here, but it was never said. So I found myself here in the home, and when those words weren't said, then I realized that it had something to do with also like the absence of the other narratives that I saw that were sort of, well, just never spoken about with regard to other things.
Everything that we're telling is based on documentary evidence that we have, and that we've tried to be as inclusive as possible with the story of the house. That it's not only the Calhouns and the Clemsons, but it's the African American experience at Fort Hill.
Well, I think the superstitions are rooted in ignorance. I think that it's really difficult for people to acknowledge that Clemson's history is rooted in the practice of slavery, that we are built on a plantation, that enslaved people labored here, sharecroppers and their children labored here, men and boys who were convicted of many of the minor crimes, such as stealing $5 worth of merchandise, were impressed into service and forced to build our college. Wage workers, mostly African Americans, worked here for very low wages.
Somehow this began as part of a campus tour. The campus tour guides started sharing this information, and then even as we've tried to dissuade the visitor center from spreading this information, I still hear tour guides today in front of the house, and they will sort of say, well, sort of with a disclaimer, well, we used to say that you couldn't go in the house or you wouldn't graduate, but now we don't say that.
I just pass it every day on my way to my dorm, but I've never actually come by. I know you're not supposed to go on a tour because then you won't graduate. I don't know, maybe one person went on a tour and then they didn't have much luck, and so then it just kind of got passed down through everyone else that was here.
I don't know if it necessarily is important. I guess it'd give them a better idea of like Clemson as a whole, but I know a lot of students come here not really caring about their history, the history of Clemson, so I guess it could go either way.
And I think that looking away is reflected in refusal to go into the house, look beyond the surface of the antiques and the architecture and the artwork, and say, who lived here? How did this house function? Where did enslaved people work and sleep and eat? How did they live on this property?
It's really, we use the house as a backdrop, a diorama, as you might have it, to tell a narrative about the families, the events that took place.
No matter what part of history you look at, it's always complicated. But at Clemson, we've tried to pretty it up and make it make us proud and happy, and and we want to whitewash and dismiss and push away from anything that reveals the truth.
But revealing the truth is not easy, and it is certainly not comfortable. So although the campus includes posters and other images that hint at the African American experience at Fort Hill, it is not enough. In the words of Vygotsky, to study something historically means to study it in the process of change. To encompass in research the process of a given thing's development in all its phases and changes fundamentally means to discover its nature, its essence, for it is only in movement that a body shows what it is. What does this mean for Clemson University? A good example is the See the Stripes campaign, developed by PhD student A.D. Carson.
The sight of the most exciting 25 seconds in college football was made possible by prophets from the most shameful centuries in America's history. At least we're having a conversation and we have some common language to be able to have that conversation. I think that beforehand when I was asking questions, a lot of the responses to those questions were grasping at ways to talk about what I was asking about. So using that metaphor, using the metaphor of the stripes that may have been on the backs of enslaved people, the stripes on the tiger, the stripes of land that the sharecroppers farmed, and then the stripes on the convict laborers' uniforms, it made it, I think, at least easier for us to operate inside the metaphor and have a conversation about the thing that we weren't talking about at all.
Another important conversation that we need to have is about the history of Fort Hill.
Our place as historians is sort of to, stick to the history, to stick to the facts. That's why historians like dates and events and You know, it's the interpretation of history. It's the use or sometimes the misuse of history that often makes, you know, tempers flare or ideologies conflict. And, you know, that's really that's not necessarily the realm of what we as public historians do. That's more the audience takeaway or the other things that they bring to the conversation. But I think what we can do is to share the events that transpired at Fort Hill. You know, we can't make excuses for historical figures. They're dead. These events happen. History happened. You can't go back and change what happened 100, 150, or 200 years ago.
And I think if we're going to really be a university, we got to embrace all of that. We've got to say, yes, he was a very established, you know, man in the 19th century, but being affiliated with John C. Calhoun, being affiliated with Canebrake, his own plantation, and Fort Hill, he was a slaveholder.
Fort Hill is more than a memorial to two men, their accomplishments, and philanthropy. Its history is much broader. It's also a memorial to the injustices done on this land, a memorial to our other legacies, the legacy of the Cherokee who lived here, the African American slaves who worked here, and to the systematic use of convict labor in a Jim Crow South Carolina to build much of what is now Clemson University. Only through acknowledgement of other histories, through memorialization of injustices done, memorialization of our other legacies, can we make Fort Hill a healthy part of this university. But in order to make this happen, we must be brave. We must be participants. We must be tigers.
So there has to be a boldness and a courageousness in our leaders, and not just, you know, President Clements, but all parts of the administration, so that it's not just faculty, it's not just students, but it's all of us working together to initiate that change.